Morning. I was already packed up and ready to go fellowship, and because Larry said there was no teaching going on, we're just going straight to fellowship. He did. So since we are going to have class, Larry, can you lead us in a word of prayer? Right, so this is our last class. Next week, I guess, Larry, you're teaching. Larry and Clark and I think Jay will be dividing up the summer quarter. But the last 2 weeks we've gone through the life of Joshua, and it was really kind of leading up to this particular class. There's not really a better case study on leadership in the Bible than Joshua. I mean, Joshua is not, if you kind of use your AI tools and you go through who are the most influential leaders of Israel, Joshua wouldn't make the list. Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Elijah. Those are the people who were transformational. They had key events that occurred in their life that were transformational to the people of Israel. Joshua is very different. Joshua is not transformational. He's not inspirational. Joshua is none of those things. But the thing about Joshua was he was extremely focused. And so this morning I wanted to talk about why. Why, if you ask a different question of AI and you ask who was the most successful leader of Israel, funny, first name that pops up is Joshua. And once again, it's all a matter of how you phrase the question. Joshua was the most effective, and I wanted to discuss why. And so, everybody's kind of got a different career, life experience. But one of the things that was always a challenge for KPMG, the company I worked with, was leadership. It's not easily taught. It differs depending on who your actual leader is. It's hard to push down from the top, especially in an organization that's made up of A-type personalities. And so leadership is elusive. Leadership is situational in some people's view. And it is a difficult task. Everybody here has been a part of an organization or has had to model leadership in one way or the other. So Jay experienced military definition of leadership and how leadership is executed. Very different than you would see at a corporation. Very different than you would see in a company like KPMG. So as each of you kind of think back, how did you develop your leadership style? What was the method that was important and transformational to you as a parent, as in your career, and in various other aspects where you were asked to lead? How did you get where you got? And what were the things that, as you aged, you wish you'd have known sooner? So, everything. Larry? Mm-hmm. Jay? other thoughts? Sure. Right. Okay. So let's take a look at Joshua. Um, One of the ways to kind of categorize him was strength, strategy, and spirituality were kind of the keys to Joshua, and I'm going to go through a couple different approaches to this. But one of the things that we find about Joshua is he at a very young age was assigned to be Moses' assistant. So he spent almost 40 years as an apprentice, as someone who was learning from Moses. As we talked about last week, he went up Mount Sinai, not to the top. He sat outside the temple of meeting when Moses would go in to talk to God. And he watched and learned. As Larry and Jay both pointed out, a huge part of being a good leader is having good mentorship, if you're lucky enough to get it. And in Joshua's case, he was immensely blessed. Moses may have had his flaws, but Moses accomplished a lot as the leader of Israel. And the good news for Joshua is he saw both sides. He saw what Moses did well. He saw how Moses reacted to the disobedience of the Israelites. He saw how God communicated with him. So Joshua mastered the first part, which is critical for all of us. Do you learn as you're going along? Do you understand that each day God is teaching you a lesson? The question is, are you receptive to it? And are you self-aware? Do you learn from what you're experiencing? The next thing is, when Moses went away and was told he wasn't going into the promised land, there was no confusion about the succession plan. Joshua was ordained. He was told, you are going to take over the leadership of these people. Now, before we jump places here, a number of people were ordained leaders in Israel and failed miserably. So it was clear he was ordained. But Joshua knew and understood what God's plan for him was. Next, as I talked about 2 weeks ago, God saw something in Joshua's personality and was really consistent about telling Joshua one thing: be strong and be courageous. He told it to him 5 times. He got told it by the other leaders of Israel one time, and he got told it by the people of Israel one time. For whatever reason, God saw in Joshua the need for him to understand, I don't need you to be Moses, but I need you to have faith in me. Be strong and be courageous, because I am behind you. I will ensure your success if you can handle those 2 traits. Jesus tells us the same thing about our lives. Next, he understood the challenge he had. Joshua, he inherited the same group of people that Moses had so many problems with. This is not a new group of people. This is the same group that constantly fails the Lord. So he's inheriting a people who are rebellious. He's replacing a legend. If you ever try and watch people who step in for legends, the success rate is abysmal. I mean, you look at the people, how many large corporations bring back their ex-CEO? Because the person who replaced them can't get there. List is pretty long. I mean, I can rattle them all. Starbucks, GE, Apple. I can keep going. The next thing was he had to be kind of a unique person because he was not only a leader, but he was also the commander of a military. So he had to have both sides of the equation that Jay and Larry talked about. He had to handle a military, but he also had to handle a people. Yeah, two distinct roles, two distinct requirements. And more than anybody, Joshua seems to have understood it really isn't about me. And as we talked about, the classic example is Joshua's first military excursion was all based upon whether or not Moses could keep the staff up. Great initial lesson for anybody. If you think it's about you, greatest lesson I ever got. I was really young at KPMG. I'd been over consulting. Guy stood up in front of the class, had a glass of water in his hand, stuck his finger in it. And he goes, pay attention to the water level. Okay? See the glass? With the finger in there, that's you at KPMG. He took his finger out, said, notice the water level. That's you when we fire you. Nothing changed. And I had to admit, I was sitting there going, wow, I get it. That makes sense. It's not about you. Joshua understood that. And the other thing about Joshua was he more than anybody in the Bible seemed to take to heart what he was told in Joshua 1:8. After he had been told to be strong and courageous, the Lord asked him to meditate on the scriptures. Meditate on what you've learned day and night. Don't get confused. Don't lose focus on why you are where you are. The next point we talked about, he had to have a consistency to be the one that takes Israel into the promised land. He doesn't have to be charismatic. He doesn't have to put on a big show. He's not overcoming any known obstacles. God has told him the land is yours. Just be courageous. Just be obedient. He understood that the goal that he was to take on was to make sure the people of Israel followed God. Everything else was inconsequential. And, once again, I always try and apply the lessons learned here. If as a leader of a family, pick your poison, if you make people understand it's about being obedient to the Lord, everything else will kind of fall in place. If you follow Christian principles, they don't generally let you down. Do they create conflicts? Sure. But if you can overcome the conflicts, God's told you he will. If you follow them, people will listen, people will understand, and people will follow. God has promised that. Joshua understood that. The other thing about Joshua was, of all the people in the Old Testament, he is the example of humility. I mean, go read the story of Joshua and tell me where he made it about him. It's going to be hard to find. And lastly, you look at the things where we do have limited examples, but when he does communicate, he's extremely clear. He doesn't make it complicated. It's extremely clear. Next, he was a role model, which, you know, there's a lot of things in life that I think you can kind of, and the next slide really kind of goes through what I think is I tried to correlate Joshua's life to the things that are modern. But the one thing you can't get around, it's really hard to be an effective leader if you're not a role model for what you're preaching. People see through it. If you tell people it's about honesty and integrity and your first business deal, they watch you cut corners and not be honest, how far are you going to get? You're going to teach a lesson, but it's not the lesson that's in your quote-unquote core values. Yeah, and I think the one thing I always, as Larry and Jay both said, you can learn from bad leaders too. Not the lesson you want to learn, but you see the consequences of bad leaders, and the Bible, the Old Testament is full of them. The consequences of bad leadership are a loss of life with God. And that's really Joshua's story. The last slide I hope you can read, because that's really where no, you can't. So what I tried to do here, and I will read it because you can't see it, is, I tried to take the things that we know about Joshua and equate them to today. So I'm going to go through them verbally for you real quick. He had a servant's heart. So I tried to compare that to the books that I was required to read on leadership, okay? And I use the word required. I am not a big read something and apply it. I'm more in modeling. But I had untold number of people who were my bosses for a period of time, and each of them had a different book. So the book that I actually got to be honest with you, was actually very good, was that deals with servant leadership, is John Maxwell's book on developing leadership within. And the whole point of John Maxwell's book is, sometimes you get thrust in the job of leadership and you didn't ask for it. You didn't ask to be put in this situation. So in those situations, you have to rely on what's in you. Nobody's going to give you a book. Nobody's going to give you a pass. You've been asked to lead. You better have a blueprint inside of you that you can fall back on. And we see that with Joshua. We talked about his apprenticeship. We talked about his modeling. You have to have a clear driven. You have to have a clear vision. And the famous book there is Purpose-Driven Leadership by Simon Sinek. Everybody who lived at BioCore, Bearing Point, and KPMG had to read the book, Start With Why. I mean, I don't know how many people thrust that book down my throat. Not a big fan of the book, but once again, had to read it because I had 3 of my bosses basically gave it out as mandatory reading. I didn't find it to be near as impactful as some of the other books I read, but it talks about a purpose-driven leadership. In Joshua's case, his purpose was to conquer the promised land, and he never deviated. In the business world, purpose-driven leadership is not a great model for a Christian, in my view. You can have lots of purposes that aren't necessarily good for your organization. You can have lots of purposes that don't model what I would call Christian leadership. So I had a number of clients whose whole goal was to get wealthy. They hired consultants to do that. But that's not a really valid goal if you're not really going to make that synonymous with making sure other people are successful. It can lead to a conflict. The next one was, really kind of dealing with obedience to a higher authority. And that's called principle-centered leadership in today's vernacular. And one of the better books, it got famous for a reason, it's actually very good, is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it basically says, if you're not going to lead based upon principles, you're going to fail. And for a Christian, that's the Bible. You know, you start in Genesis and you end in Revelation, and it tells you that's the story of your life. If you're not going to be a principle-based Christian or leader or whatever role you get, you're going to fail. And Joshua obviously understood that. The next one was courage and resilience. Courageous leadership. I never read Brene Brown's book on that, but it's pretty famous. No one ever forced me to read that one. I read the synopsis of it, but courageous leadership was basically the principle by which Joshua had to lead. I mean, like I said, wasn't forced to read it, so I can't really comment on it other than reading the Cliff Notes. Empowering others. Joshua, if you read how he went about conquering the Promised Land and dividing up the Promised Land, that was kind of the cornerstone of his leadership. He got it done in a very contentious time where people were given the results of their labor. How many of you have ever had to hand out bonuses? Yeah. How'd that work out? Yeah. Not a very popular time because you have to communicate a message. Unlike what Jay said, you ain't all equal. And people think they're highly effective. I have to admit, I was kind of blessed to be in the organization I was in. It's a numbers-driven business. If Larry generated $2 million in revenue and Jay generated 5, Jay managed 500 people, Larry managed 100, who's going to get the bigger bonus? Not complicated. Now, Larry didn't like the message because he's got but. In my world, but doesn't get you anywhere. Jay gets the bigger bonus. Sorry. And here's the sad news for Larry's team. They don't get the big bonus either. Jay's people are eating up the bonus. Not happy, but Joshua understood that at the end of the day, he had to make it all about creating a win-win situation when he divided up the land. Not easy. But Joshua never really deviated. The next one was faith in action. And that's really kind of, once again, the concept today is value-based leadership. Number of books out there about that. No one stood out to me. And legacy and continuity. Joshua and Moses and God understood it. The transition from Moses to Joshua was seamless and successful. And the interesting thing about Joshua, when you read his epitaph, it says, the people of Israel followed Joshua all the days of his life, and people stopped there. Greatest epitaph in the Bible in one man's opinion. Only written about him. But we stopped there and we missed the part where it says, and the people who led after Joshua. So Joshua got it. It wasn't like Israel sinned the day Joshua died. There's a period, if you study the historians, of 30 years after Joshua's death that Israel was faithful to the Lord. Because of the method and the process that went with Moses, Joshua, and his successors. It's the lasting impact that all of us have. And the best book on that is really, it's funny. It's Succession Planning is Ken Blanchard's book. Ken wrote a number of books. And he covers it extremely well. If you want to have a good succession, make sure you rely on your people. Make sure you put them in the situations that you are undergoing, but give them cover. Give them cover. Julie only met the people I work for one time. It was when I was leaving. And so she asked people, she goes, and these people had worked for me for a long time. And I didn't really bring work home much. It wasn't, what I did is kind of hard to describe anyway. And Julie asked the 4 who were my direct reports who were at the meeting, and she goes, All right. This was fun. This was entertaining. And you all poke fun at each other pretty much nonstop for about an hour and a half now. Why did you guys work together so long? You know, Jeff's obviously not the smartest guy in the group, to which they all agree. And then no problem there at all. But they actually, one thing is, and I wasn't there when they were having this conversation, Julie said the one thing that Jeff did that really allowed us to flourish was he let us do our jobs, and whatever flack came from that, he kept it away from us. It was the one thing that if you could ask me, she said, the one thing they said was, no matter what, you took the bullets. And she said, it's interesting that that's the one thing they remember for you. I started laughing. I said, all right, so the summary of that 24 years was he worked hard and he took bullets. So, but Joshua was better than that. He just kind of was steady. He was the guy who, when God said we're going into the promised land, who never deviated. He just did what he was asked to do. And it's amazing, the net message from Joshua is if you role model and follow God's plan for you, there won't be a lot of glory, but there will be a just reward. And like I said, the epitaph of Joshua is by far the greatest epitaph in the Bible. He was the leader of Israel for 30 years. And the people who left him and took over the leadership role led for 30 years. 60 years, the people of Israel had no idols, no conflict with God, and were successful. Same thing as what, my point, if you're looking for an example of leadership for you as a family, as a business, for anywhere else, spend a lot of time with Joshua. It's an invaluable lesson. I believe Larry will have you next week. Thank you.